Welcome to this fifth webinar of our online series celebrating public space. Actually, this is not a webinar, this is a meeting, because we decided to keep these opportunities kind of informal to create a direct connection between speakers and audience. So that everyone in the audience can actually jump in at the end of the presentations and ask questions directly to the speakers. If you prefer, you can actually write down a question to the speakers or your comments in the chat throughout the meeting, even during presentations, and we will then moderate the discussion with the speakers. My name is Luisa Bravo. I'm the president of City Space Architecture, a non-profit organization based in Italy, and I'm co-moderating this meeting today with Sebnem Hoskara from Eastern Mediterranean University, since this ongoing series is a joint initiative developed by City Space Architecture and Eastern Mediterranean University. Sebnem,
yes.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, and I will switch back as well. Well, I would like to welcome you all. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We are still using these new means of communication. Probably this is the only good thing about COVID-19 pandemics that is left to us. I would like to welcome you all to the series that we are having on this special day, World Cities Day. Every October, UN Habitat and its partners organize a month of events and discussions on urban sustainability. These events start with World Habitat Day on the first Monday of October each year, and they end with World Cities Day on the October 31st. And this whole month is called Urban October. Urban October is actually an opportunity for everyone to be part of the conversation about the challenges and opportunities created by rapid change in our cities and towns. Each October, under Urban October, anyone interested in sustainable urbanization, from national and local governments to universities to NGOs and communities, they're all encouraged to organize and participate in virtual or physical events and discussions. World Cities Day is the last day of Urban October on the 31st, as I have mentioned, each year, and it was first celebrated in 2014. A global observance is held in a different city each year, and the day focuses on specific themes, just like the World Habitat Day. Well, this year's, you may have heard already, this year's global observance is organized in Shanghai, China, and the theme is Act Local to Go Global. The intention is actually to bring different partners and diverse stakeholders together to share their experiences and approaches to local action, what local action worked and what is needed to empower the local and regional governments in order to create greener, more equitable, safer and sustainable cities. This year, as my colleague has already mentioned, as a part of our collaboration of Eastern Mediterranean University, Urban Research and Development Center and City Space Architecture, we are organizing a webinar to celebrate World Cities Day as a part of our ongoing celebrations for public space. Both City Space Architecture and our research center here in EMU, we are both supporters of United Nations Global Goals for Sustainable Development. We are the advocates of inclusive, safe, green, and equitable and sustainable cities and communities. So our local activities ranging from academic events to research projects, to workshops, to professional design projects. They are all for a global impact, in addition to solving our local problems in wherever we are located. And both EMU, URDC, and City Space Architecture believe that public spaces are valuable and powerful tools to support the implementation of sustainable development goals. With this, again, I would like to leave the word to my colleague Luisa for maybe to add something more on public spaces for this special day.
Yes, thank you, Sebnem. Yes, for those of you who do not know regarding our initiatives on public space, City Space Architecture is partner of UN Habitat, and we cooperate in particular with the Global Public Space Program. And we have developed since our foundation in 2013 a number of projects, initiatives, and a program of activities focusing on public space, including the Journal of Public Space, the web magazine Mastering Public Space, and now we are about to launch this new academic educational program, Public Space Academy, which is supposed to bring knowledge, theoretical knowledge, coming from the best scholars working in the field of public space into practice-led approaches that could support implementation of local solutions. So I'm very happy that we are celebrating public space today on these World Cities Days, linking global approach to contemporary challenges and translating those very complex and challenging issues into some critical solutions that could be implemented at the local level in terms of quality of life for urban residents, so that those principles that we usually discuss, theoretically, can actually find methodologies, tools, and best practices to be implemented. Our cooperation with the Eastern Mediterranean University is aiming at spreading knowledge regarding how public space can actually become a key asset for sustainable development, and how we can actually cooperate with universities in order to fulfill this mission. We cooperate also with many other universities since our mission is global. But we are very interested in this cooperation with Eastern Mediterranean University because we would like to explore how public space can become an agent of change in those territories that are experiencing divisions and conflicts. And so Cyprus is certainly one of the most interesting case studies. We already had an event at the World Urban Forum that took place in June in Poland, with a joint initiative between City Space Architecture and Eastern Mediterranean University regarding specifically the power of public space in areas that are experiencing conflicts and divisions. So we will continue also on that stream of research and activities. But today, let's celebrate public space on this very important occasion with our two speakers that we really want to thank you for accepting our invitation. So Sebnem, would you like to introduce our speakers?
Yep. Okay, yes, thank you very much, Luisa. Well, our first speaker is Çelen Paşalar, who is an associate professor of landscape architecture and environmental planning from North Carolina State University in USA. Dr. Paşalar's expertise involves organizing and promoting numerous design and planning projects for the benefit of communities, preliminary throughout North Carolina. Çelen Paşalar received her undergraduate degree in architecture from Middle East Technical University in Turkey and her master's degree in urban design from the same university. Then she has received her doctorate degree from College of Design, North Carolina State University, with a focus on community and environmental design in 2004. Well, there's a lot to talk about, Çelen, but I think for using the time efficiently, I would like to leave the screen to her so that from what she is going to share with us on this special day, we will understand her research expertise already from what she is going to talk about. Yes, Çelen, the screen is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebnem. Let me share my screen first to make sure that everything hopefully still will work okay. All right. So can you see it and hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, depending on which time zone you're located in. I'm very excited actually to be here in this meaningful webinar with you today. As Sebnem mentioned, I'm joining you from Raleigh, North Carolina, in United States. And my presentation today actually will focus on a little bit different topic that my co-speaker today, but I'm hoping that it's going to make us think further in terms of these emerging trends that we are seeing globally in most of our cities. So my presentation will focus on the changing nature of urban public spaces, particularly within the context of sharing economies that we're seeing as growing trend, again, globally and also here in the United States. So through my presentation, I will briefly talk about an ongoing research that actually I have been conducting together with a multidisciplinary team in the area of smart, connected, and healthy cities. And I will particularly talk about a small portion of it actually that focuses on design and to some extent policy issues related to new sharing economies and how these policies and emerging business practices are changing the use of urban public spaces. And I will first begin by reviewing some of the basic understandings and terminology that actually has guided our actions as urban designers, architects, landscape architects, and planners for many decades. And then I will review some of the technologies and business platforms that have arrived actually over the last decade or so, and also look at what spatial implications they have on how we might use and manage our public spaces in the future due to actually these evolving technologies and business changes that are globally emerging and growing. And this is particularly important as we continue actually to aim for achieving more inclusive, safe, resilient, and healthy cities for the future. And in the meantime, actually helping the cities meet their sustainability goals in terms of the physical environment, economy, and social cultural environments. So throughout history, the city actually has been essentially a shared space, including its public open spaces like plazas and streets. But today, with the increasing urban population density and how the technology is enabling the Internet of Things, the city actually has become even more conducive site for complex actually sharing activities. And one such complex activity is what we call as the space sharing practice, which is, again, an urban phenomenon that has so far emerged in the new forms of sharing spatial resources the creation of the new shared spaces, and the production of new, in a way, social spatial sharing relations. So through this presentation, I'm primarily trying to address what possible impacts do sharing economies have on the way urban public spaces are generated, used, and changed. And in my opinion, this is a very timely question to ask, considering how rapidly post-COVID times actually, in addition to evolving technologies and other factors, are continuing to challenge us with emerging business models and also changing actually human behavior patterns. And I will argue that actually our public spaces in our cities are being challenged in a way how they afford the way that we interface, again, socially, economically, and culturally. And they're still one of our important civilizing elements. So over the last half century, architects, planners, and researchers like Kevin Lynch, William White, Cooper Marcus, and Jane Jacobs, they have all studied and theorized about the way that how we interact in urban public spaces, how urban spaces function now, what their purposes are, how they operate, what kinds of behaviors actually happen in them, and so on. So for example, in this scene of the High Line project in New York City that I'm sure you are very familiar with, we see an extraordinarily actually successful project that kind of interviews the public and private uses and affords actually those activities like encountering, congregating, interacting, and many more. So public spaces have historically functioned as the socioeconomic center of our cities. But will those spatial patterns actually change with the growing trend of what we call as the sharing economy? So firstly, let's review actually a few terms that can help us actually to set the baseline understandings. So a sharing economy actually refers to, again, that collaborative consumption or peer-to-peer economies, providing that process for underused actual resources to be easily shared or transferred to others to create more value or to bring more benefits actually to society. And over the last decade, the concept of sharing economy has attracted actually that great deal of attention, particularly in economic, political, and social terms. So as those sharing platforms like Airbnb, VRBO, Uber, Lyft have undergone that explosive growth, regulatory and political battles, both pro and con, have also evolved. So supporters argue that these new sharing technologies and platforms actually will produce maybe some wonderful results of related to energy efficiency and the empowerment of actually ordinary people, but also there are critics condemning actually them for being predatory and exploitative practices, claiming that they focus on actually economic self-interest rather than sharing. So this diagram actually borrowed from Crowd Companies has clustered different sharing technologies and platforms into these 6 different categories: money, goods, food, services, transportation, and space. And although all these categories actually could have a bearing on how public urban spaces function, it will seem that actually services like services, transportation, and space would have the most immediate impact. And this diagram also shows how pervasive each category of sharing was, even back in the 2014 economy. And it is startling actually to see how Airbnb and Uber started in 2008 and 2009 are barely actually a blip on this diagram, even though they now have major impact on our urban neighborhoods and communities several years later. So, but sharing activities are often narrowly understood, or primarily, I will say, they are framed on the basis of economic transactions, and space is only recognized as the background reality that accommodates such transaction. So we need to recognize the spatial dimension of sharing as an essential variable in explaining this phenomenon of sharing. And unfortunately, there has not been very much examination of emerging space sharing practices in contemporary cities. And so far, this phenomenon actually has remained very vague. So central to space sharing practice is the recognition that physical space can be designed and configured into a shareable resource, and that there are certain resources that will be more effectively shared in actual and spatial environment. And as a result of these evolving business models, we are seeing space sharing practices are happening in different forms. So one is the space of sharing, which relates to the different ways of sharing spaces and the different typologies of shared space. The second one is the space and sharing. And what we mean by that is the different roles that space can play in facilitating or enabling sharing activities and practices. And the third one is space for sharing, which relates to how environmental design can create affordances for sharing and enabling social transformations. So in order to help understand how urban public spaces may well be changed by sharing economies and related technologies, enabling these business platforms, we suggest actually looking at the public to private continuum within urban public areas and the private buildings and spaces actually that also surround them. So borrowing this term, transect, it can help us actually depict this spectrum. So in this image, we see the idea of a traditional transect from public to private, from the center of the street, which is the most public zone, to the privacy of individual buildings actually alongside of this dense mixed use, but primarily business corridor. And although it is easier to demonstrate a transect when talking about a section cut perhaps perpendicular to the center line of a street, the same transect idea also holds true actually along the edges of other types of urban public spaces. So like where public space, park or plaza abuts actually private buildings, there is this transition from the most public spaces of the plaza to the privacy inside buildings or privately controlled spaces along the edges of the public spaces. So although this transect at a commercial street depicts a common scene from the later half of the 20th century to the current times, it actually presents a comparable social and spatial methods to protect and separate the public from the private, like sidewalks, entries to private offices or residential apartments, and the permeable front wall of private businesses. But primarily, as it is evident in these scenes, they provide clear distinction and space allocations and are largely car-oriented and car-centric environments, which is creating this spatial actual tension between cars and people and the concept of sharing over the years. So over the last 2 decades, though, we have seen changes happening with the 20th century public-private transect as we continue to rethink and upgrade our streets to more environmentally and socially appropriate designs, following the standards like complete streets. We might consider this diagram as near-term public-private transect we may experience in most of the particularly US cities, streets, plazas, and parks. And in this transect diagram, we see a clear demarcation of, again, that transition from the most public on the right through the layers of bike paths, walkway, and retail frontage to the most private spaces inside the building on the far left side. So the idea of complete street guidelines and development has been a very positive direction for our cities, presenting more flexibility to adapt to changing human behaviors and patterns, as well as business practices actually in the communities. So the question for us to ask is how this diagram actually, the bands or the layers of transition from the public zone of the street to the inside of the building will continue to change as more and more those sharing technologies and practices are added to the way the streetscapes actually function. So it is important to note that the impact of many space sharing practices and tools or associated technologies are either inherently spatial or manifested spatially. For example, the applications like Waze and Apple Maps or Google Maps, which enable that real-time crowdsourced traffic tips to car drivers who are desperately perhaps trying to navigate those congested highways in Los Angeles or in New Jersey in United States, or maybe in Istanbul, Egypt, or other cities. or Cairo in other countries. So, however, we now have to deal with unexpected consequences and the impact of these tools on our once perhaps quiet neighborhoods or community streets, now overflowing actually with rush hour traffic jams and also late night actually fast traffic, destroying the quality of life for the residents and limiting perhaps the potential activities that how shared streets actually can support their residents. Another example to think about is the dogless, bike share or scooter programs and the benefits of this sharing practice. That is the freedom and convenience actually to park and pick up bicycles or scooters anywhere in the city, and is often actually achieved at the cost of inconveniencing the others actually who share the same urban space as the riders. So in other words, the innovative way of sharing the space itself may turn out to be the cause of the problems that we encounter in a shared space. So the disturbance can be in terms of noise, it can be in terms of visual pollution, safety may provide inconveniences as we try to walk and perhaps use our streets for different activities like play, exercise, education, and social gatherings in a way that we also observed as the changing behaviors, uses of the streets resulting in those meaningful experiences for people, particularly during COVID-19 pandemic. So we need to think about the impact of many space sharing practices, as well as those consumer-based technologies enabling sharing resources or data that can actually influence the quality of lives in our neighborhoods and shared public spaces like streets, as we continue to think about those also positive changes in local contexts, like what we see on this slide, depicting actually some of the future possibilities in the neighborhoods of Raleigh, North Carolina, making the streets actually perhaps more truly a shared space for everyone beyond cars, as well as what we see in this example of before and after improvements considered and applied to the Pike and Pine corridor actually in Seattle in United States. So automated vehicles, on the other hand, are also being developed and experimented in different countries from Asia to Americas and to Europe as part of shared ride programs or ideas that are emerging. Although these innovations can have enormous value, perhaps to life, safety, and sustainability, we should also consider how the required changes in our roads will impact the shared spaces with people surrounding them. So the image on this slide actually considers additional consequences that we should think about in terms of how we design and structure our roadways in order to accommodate this emerging, technology that we know that it's going to be here, and the current deficiency of automated vehicles in the meantime, how we can make sure that we can enable perhaps safer and more equitable shared spaces between people and these automated vehicles. So the rise of ride sharing in the current times and the ongoing experiments with autonomous vehicles in that sense is, happening for some of us in the cities. And for some, the autonomous vehicles are considered in a way they will either eliminate car crashes and save the environment by offering shared services, minimizing, carbon emissions. But for others, they will muscle out actually the pedestrians from the street and perhaps create major gridlock in our cities. So despite this divide over how this technology should be implemented for ride-sharing purposes, we should try to anticipate actually the future impacts of self-driving cars. For example, will they require drop-off zones? How will they interact with pedestrians? What does that infrastructure actually will look like? And at this point, cities and we actually as designers are sadly unprepared, as well as not much involved in those conversations and for the changes that self-driving may bring for our public spaces, particularly for our streets. So it's really important for us to begin and also continue to research, design, plan, get involved in those efforts, conversations for the rapidly approaching changes that we know arising from, again, from the evolution of the semi-autonomous and driverless vehicle and experiments right now. So this is not as a cautionary tale, but this offers an opportunity for creating more inclusive and perhaps positive urban change, again, that starts at the local level. Another form of sharing practice that is undergoing and rapidly growing is apartment and house sharing. In recent years, a considerable number of studies actually have looked at the major problems related to short-term vacation rentals or accommodations like VRBO and Airbnb. Usually these studies look at actually problems like intensive gentrification, exclusion, and prohibitive actually rents or housing costs. But also of concern is, although far less studied, is the rapid change that happens in the neighborhoods related to their identity, social culture, and public to private terms. So we can say that the impacts of space sharing practices are mostly considered as the ripple effects of the sharing economy. And in this case, space may not be immediately or directly affected by sharing practice, but as a stage actually in this sharing practice, it will be unavoidably implicated in its subsequent impacts and influences. And in many cities, for example, the rapid consumption of otherwise more valuable urban space for new commercial properties and the associated problems of congestion, parking, and pollution are closely actually have been linked to the dramatic growth and existence of Airbnbs. Or in some circumstances, Airbnbs are causing cultural, social shift, as it is the case in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans in the United States. Another example is the office sharing. In other words, a version of short-term sharing that happens in emerging workspace rental market. Such spaces are emerging, not only providing those spatial attributes that are likely to condition the possibilities and processes of sharing, but they're also enabling actually those activities that are anticipated to impact, again, the ambience, structure, and usage patterns of these places. For example, physical spaces can be purposefully configured to provide proximity in a way that will support the possibilities for unexpected encounters among business entrepreneurs, more likely, which in turn may lead to the formation of new collaborative networks that are likely to further modify and adapt these spaces for their specific needs. Workplace sharing has even expanded out into public plazas and park spaces, causing actually that shift in the public and private transect in a way. So space is more than a shareable resource. It is often a generative reality where societies, businesses, and cultures are unfolding and evolving. So today, as a result of the space sharing practices, an increasing number of new typologies of shared spaces are being created. These new spatial typologies in turn are enhance actually the sharing activities that take place in them. And this process actually foster the formation of new social and economic also relations. So most notable among them are, again, these co-working spaces and hacker spaces, which not only actually accommodate and facilitate this emerging work culture and the new lifestyle, but also actually cultivates and spur that mutual learning and collaboration and socialization. So we can anticipate that the near-term change to the public-private transect caused by space sharing practices, sharing technologies, and also business platforms that we just discussed might look something like this, perhaps what this diagram presents. But sharing economies that we are experiencing now are by no means the end of this rapid change. Researchers in the field are beginning to speculate about how, again, these technologies, autonomous vehicles, businesses built on the shared space practices, and future advancements in information sharing apps will continue actually to contribute to further changes in space sharing. For example, how will, again, self-driving cars and drone delivery technologies can change our streetscapes and urban open spaces, and what will the public-private transit look like as them? So in conclusion, we must first acknowledge that whether we accept the new sharing economies or not, they're coming, they're here, and they're quickly evolving. It is really important for us as designers and researchers in this field to be agile enough to accommodate these resulting changes as they're happening, but also get involved actually in those efforts or teams that are, kind of shifting the grounds for us. Challenges that we must respond to include an understanding of how the public to private transect in our urban spaces, the streets and buildings will change as a consequence of sharing practices. What will be the impacts of space sharing practices on urban spaces? So the first step will be to begin really, looking into those case studies, real conditions on the ground where sharing economies have already shifted the character of the local communities. In a sense, we need to establish those baselines that can be studied over time. The second step will be to develop an understanding of those affected local communities. What is their sense of identity and culture? How might that be challenged by rapid changes in sharing technologies and business platforms? And how can we better enable local residents of neighborhoods? And we need to continue to address, again, what new social spatial relations are produced by space sharing practices. And finally, how can we encourage meaningful space sharing practices, amplifying those positive and mitigating the negative impacts through purposeful design and interventions. So I'm going to leave it here and turn it to Greg.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Cenem. We are going to get the questions at the end. Well, thank you for this very interesting presentation on the economic value and aspects of public space and how this aspect interacts within the cities, what kind of new spatial relationships we should be discussing and studying further. This is going to open up a lot of questions, I believe. Now I would like to give the screen to our second speaker, Dr. Gregor Mius. He is actually joining us from University of the Sunshine Coast from Australia. He has got the Master of Urban and Regional Planning degree from TU Berlin and PhD on Environmental Design in University of Canberra. He has been teaching and researching in urban design and town planning at his university. And he was the Executive Director of Urban Synergies Group. He's a co-founder and director of the Australian Institute of Play, a steering member of UN Habitat's World Urban Campaign, and a council member of City Space Architecture and an advisory board member on research into practice of the Journal of Public Space. Again, there is a lot to tell about Greg, but I will just leave the screen to him to hear his presentation for us. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Sebnem, and everybody for having me. So I'm just trying to quickly share my screen, and in being mindful of time, I will anticipate to be brief with my contribution. Hold on, somehow at the moment I don't know why my presentation just failed my screen, so just let me get that glitch out of the matrix. Hold on. Always when you need it, it doesn't. Oh, here it is. Okay, perfect. So perhaps my contribution has a slight different flavor, but it probably reflects actually the complexity of the human condition around the world in favor of world city-states. So I think it's a contrasting but also complementary contribution to our discourse here, and it's great to see some even familiar faces in the audience today. So I'm just sharing literally with you some early observations which I just gained as part of, again, a very collaborative approach, which I just encountered in Africa, particularly around my work in Sierra Leone. So I literally just stepped off the plane and was able to put a couple of slides together along the way. So it's not a firm product, so it's still very much ongoing. And I would conceive myself perhaps as a pre-academic, always wants to put in practice and doing, and then doing a lot of research to complement that and document that. So the work what I'm presenting is very much in celebration of public space that acknowledges these two dimensions of that. And these findings are also, I've published already about it and continue to do so. So feel free to then elaborate further. So for everybody, I've just got 3 key points essentially which I'm trying to stimulate discourse on top of that, what great content already, what Selene already presented. So given that we're celebrating World City States, and it's a UN initiative, and also the university where Sebnem is also has a big commitment to the SDGs, I thought let's start on that as a common conversation point. So in order to implement the New Urban Agenda, and particular SDG 11.7 that relates directly to public space in a most effective way, we have to really continue, and we're starting to do that. It's through the observatory, etc., and other initiatives, to pay attention to the evidence that emerges, in particular that comes out of contextual case studies that are embedded in rich social cultural public space practices, and particular the grassroots level is for me at least the most strongest determinant for that, if you're really able to deliver that, or actually are we failing. So the second point what I'm going to make is that policies and guidelines, yes, they are beautiful, useful, particularly in very formalized economies. However, given that I'm talking about a country here that is positioned in the global south and not as resource rich as other parts of the world, they can often very quickly fail, and they do not actually have any kind of impact to the benefits that live and experience informality. And therefore literally bypasses and therefore again does not help us to really enable and implement the New Urban Agenda on the ground. So, and also that is of course very tied to economics, and in this case to particular when it comes with very restricted funding from traditional donors countries, and they don't allow for flexibility deployment to meet human needs and therefore achieve relief to certain human and spatial conditions. So the third point is then trust and partnerships are everything. I know we have it SDG as 17, partnerships for the goals, and we never underestimate the power of genuine collaborative partnership at eye level. So not a very hierarchical thinking, but really the co-production is very important here. And the initiative, what I'm reporting on, is essentially framed around placemaking solutions. As we all know, here is our collective that deploys very much the cheaper, quick and light opportunities to particularly improve safety perception in informal settlements, because that comes with a whole package of different issues than it is perhaps in let's say here where I'm at the moment here in Germany. Then in order to harness the creative potential and also combine that with greening places in face of the climate crisis, it does create a lot of co-benefits. And for that, you really do need a local and international partners that really in the light of the heaviness what is hitting us at system level perhaps calls for also playful and ways of engagement with that information, how we can co-create a future worth living, and that research of course very closely to that, and we definitely need that and flexible funding as we move on in our pursuit of existing on the face of this planet. Okay, so just for everybody who perhaps is not familiar where Sierra Leone is, it's a small country in West Africa. It has approximately 9 million people living and calling it home. It is also one of the least developed countries in the world, and if you would like to have a project to start on, you don't know where you can start on, because there are a lot of multidimensional and complex issues require partnerships. So it's always good for me to be there and continue to the work on the ground. It is a country where a large part of the population is under 35. In fact, 80% of the population. The country, for everybody who's not so familiar with it, has been had a long time a civil war, which took out a big part of the population, and then later on in the early 21st century had also the Ebola pandemic, and just had to recover, was heavily impacted from that. 4,000 people died there on that pandemic. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic did not help to stimulate the economy either. And currently, again, we are in a fragile state where they had just recently some youth riot, the internet was shut down, and for a period to stabilize the conditions in the country. So that gives you perhaps a very brief insight into the contemporary urban condition in the country. And I'd rather say always 1,000 pictures say, and a picture says more than 1,000 words. So I share with you 3 slides that contextualize public everyday life in public space, what we call and conceive as public space in Sierra Leone. So just enjoy, and then without me actually necessary talking about them, we can deconstruct them later. So okay, this was the first one. Now the second one. Okay, and now the third one. So these were the short little 3 snaps of impression in relation to the work I've been doing at the moment. So we've done, with our partners, we've done a training across the country where we're working in informal settlements with the urban youth to empower them through placemaking initiatives. And each one of them, actually, the first one shows you the main roads in the country and the state of the infrastructure provisions. And then the second one was essentially children playing in the settlement and right next to the space we created where we can meet and share ideas with the young people. And the third one is essentially during this one session. And I put in this little snippet here of a local dance group in order to lift their collective spirit and sharing the practice, what they're doing in public space. So, and then based on that notion, I think it's a nice start, and also then where we can discuss it together. There's a great little quote from Herman Melville, perhaps anybody who's the book nerd like me. It's the author from Moby Dick. And he already essentially said, we cannot live only for ourselves. 1,000 fibers connect us with our fellow men. And among those fibers are sympathetic threads. Our actions run as causes and they come back to us effects. Essentially, there's something in us which connects us all, makes us human, and is inherently relational. And essentially, that's what we're trying to bring out. And working on public spaces, the urban common ground, is a great way to start and transform the human condition with a sense of immediacy, arguably. We know in the new urban agenda, as I mentioned earlier, we have got the target SDG 11.7, where we need to report on the progress on public space. And it's always such a delight to be part of such a collective effort here, and also be able to make a contribution as part of Urban October. And in the new urban agenda, there is, when you work with this document, for example, which I know Luisa and I, we were both involved in the whole process to lead up to this document. There is a great section in the beginning, and that directly relates to our discourse, what we're having today. And that is relates to that public spaces with their participatory nature, that they have to or should be promoting civic engagement and gender sense of belonging and ownership among their inhabitants, prioritize safe, inclusive, acceptably green and quality public spaces. Where everybody, literally even the generational gender equal, can actually prosper and flourish and meet essentially all their human needs, and recognize also the specific needs of those which are in the most vulnerable situations. And I think that's where then that work, what I've been doing at the moment, kicks in. Interesting also enough is when you work and deal with people that live in underprivileged conditions, I'd say, their level of reading and writing is very low. Yeah? And also concepts and ideas that emerge related to public space can be completely foreign to them. Often what I learned as part of the research when we've gone into settlements, which have thousands of people call it their home, they have no idea what the space between the structures means, simply because they've been so caught up with meeting their needs of everyday life. Sorry. So what we ended up doing is we had to co-create a definition of public space, what they understand in the Sierra Leone context, what public space might mean. And that definition, you can see that in front of you here on the screen. So, but interesting enough, as we co-created that with our local partners and translated that process into Creole, that's what they speak in Sierra Leone, we found that actually they all agreed very quickly on the same common principle that public space should be available to people of all ages, where they can meet socially every day and and feel comfortable. So you will see that often public spaces in the next couple of slides, it actually has some kind of structure around it in the roof, simply because the tropic environment, the humidity is so high there, otherwise I could not really find comfortable places. And land tenure is of course a big issue as well. So these spaces are safe, accessible, free of cost, inclusive, free of discrimination, enjoyable, encourage idea sharing. And then those spaces actually contribute to their collective well-being. So that was what they came up with, and they can take form and shape in different kind of forms. So this bootcamp, what we've done, this tour, is we again interrogated the place qualities that emerged out of the literature over so many years, and then already pointed to some of the scholars out there that have written largely on place qualities. So however, what we did, instead of just taking and applying them here, we again actually did co-design and interrogated some of these attributes with the people that use them. So therefore, we had to culturally adjust, and we came up with these qualities there. First and foremost, they have to be safe. Yeah, in its broadest sense. So they're sociable for all, particularly coming down to talking about the possibility to self-manage, also achieving sensory comfort. That means hearing, smelling, all these sorts of things, having great memories. So, and making great memories to actually change the narrative of being shaped by generations of stress, the acute stress and the systemic issues of survival. You cannot believe how important it is to change the narrative through positive memory sharing, and to use it as a binding principle between the people to break that narrative, and therefore essentially what we call healing through placemaking. It's a process-oriented placemaking approach, so it's not about necessarily the structures itself, it's about what you can do with it in order to collectively heal, and therefore self-empower and change the narrative of your community through targeted education with our partners, with the young people that often don't even have any formal education. So of course, healthy was a big one, that they're all mostly walkable. We talked about the essence to grow their own food. So food sovereignty was a big part of this discourse, and also the actions which we took then with them, creating comfortable microclimates around being protected from the elements as much as it is about shade in this heat, particularly on the mango tree. Can't believe what of effect it is in terms of present microclimates. Having exits and linkages, so how you get from the main paths, the first image I showed you with the traffic, all the way down to the heart of these settlements. And currently in Freetown alone, we have 651 of these kind of informal settlements. So it's quite a big number. And also how that relates to infrastructure provision, such as water points, wash facilities, and all these sort of things. Innovation and small-scale entrepreneurship, that is a nice little touch point again with the previous contribution, because unless we can combine any kind of spatial intervention with entrepreneurship, by sourcing the material and then putting these resources back into the community and creating circularity in it, we're not going to be able to break the codependency from donors. Yeah, so very important part, and also not able to help them in a meaningful way to shape their own future. And then the last one is activity and the use of the spaces, and that is directly linked to culture and the creation of freedom, some sense of freedom. So what we did is, and that comes to my last point, the third point is, so over the couple of years, we developed a strong partnership with Youth Dream Center Sierra Leone, and completely run locally, and they came from the background of non-formal education. So that was brilliant. And also a Danish NGO, Dreamtown, which are very interested in very progressive mutual collaboration in the Global South, and with synergies where I started with my previous head on, and we're conducting now research on the project with the University of the Sunshine Coast. So what we found is if you have these mutual partnerships and you can pull all together in the same direction, you can achieve quite powerful results, well, internal results, so to speak, because we just literally finished the deployment of the training. So we did actually modify these placemaking principles, and then everybody understood the beauty of that the community is expert, not an individual, that we looked about a place, we identified through co-creation and stakeholder analysis the partners, how they can look, and we had deployed a methodology applied to that, how we can go about it and how it can be done. So with the shared vision, we had to train, I did train last week, so in total 90 young people in these settlements, where we went out and did direct observation to create self-awareness and then turn that into skills they can take on and deploy now in their respective communities where they came from. We know if you work with a pluralistic society, because they need to collaborate here out of the necessity for survival and trust each other to a degree. Play is a very powerful narrative to break that, to break the cycle of negativity and really find a common ground how we can move on together and learn in a very different way. And that was very, really nice, powerful learning here again. And also then sharing ideas with others and going out and talking to the wide range of stakeholders, how to approach it, to advocate for resources. We did that too. And then we know that had to be founded, linked to seed funding in order to demonstrate that we trust them and they can finish and do something with these spaces. Because often they literally have nothing in that sense. So we worked on here some images where we worked around and with the young people and our local partners, and then really conditioned our eyes towards what is possible. And then we shared the findings through role play. And here's two little images from what they thought they cannot be done to what can be done. So over the course of the last 3 years, they came up with their dream together. We created a process around it, a dream catching tool, what we called it, and then that structure underneath literally emerged from drawings on butcher's paper. And in 9 communities, we created these public spaces, these community centers, essentially, and they are public space in that context. And now even started to do community gardening around them and greening. So we came already a long way, and they are the catalyst for change now within their community. And also in terms of urban health, they were very instrumental when the pandemic started, because they became the educational centers for the community to educate how to the public health messages, etc., and also provide infrastructure for them. Just stop here. I hope I'm still not over. Oh, I'm gone a bit long. But there's some resources out there. We recently just published a great article with the journal Public Space on it. So I just point you into that direction, as much as we've done some reports with collaboration with Isocarp, and then also some research, and you can download them on the websites. Okay, and if you have any questions, please, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Greg. Thank you for sharing your very latest experience with us in Africa. So now I would like to open up the platform for any questions, comments, discussions. If you are still with us, I know we're about 11 people. There's a question from Anna.
Yes, from Anna. Yes.
Are you looking into circularity of sharing economies? I guess the question goes to Ceren.
I mean, it's a good question. At the moment, we haven't, outlined it in a way to look into that, but that's something definitely that we might consider.
Any other comments? I have a question actually. Following your presentation, Ceren, what would you think of the concept of third place, third space? Because you mentioned about space sharing in space, you know, the different characteristics of spaces, or you may call typologies from a different perspectives. We have this sociological idea of third space. How does it kind of involve in your understanding, maybe?
I mean, based on my experience, I mean, that concept of third space, I mean, it depends on the context that I guess you are looking into. And in our case, really it is more about that virtuality. You know, there is this dimension of virtuality that it is kind of actually blurring, again, these boundaries of, you know, physical space versus in the virtual setting, and some of the capabilities that as extension of the physical environment that it is actually providing. So to me right now, I mean, it is important to understand, again, this evolving and changing generational understanding of and acceptance of spaces, where the current generation and emerging younger generations actually are more comfortable with that virtual space, and they're more comfortable, again, that blurriness with the actual physical environment too. So it is yet, I mean, we will have to work and see actually how that will also evolve. But we need to understand, again, from the point of what is normal, again, between the generational, you know, again, acceptance of, you know, again, this concept of spaces in a way. So I don't know if that addresses your question, Sebnem.
Yes.
How I will say in our work, I mean, we are looking at that.
Thank you.
I also have a question for both speakers. Well, I was, since actually you presented the two very different case studies and implementation practices, which I found both very interesting, I was trying to link them somehow. And so correct me if I'm wrong. What I understood from Celen is that probably the risk associated with this approach is privatization of public space. Because, you know, you said that, you know, there is this blurred boundary between private and public, and especially in Europe, this is a very sensitive topic, you know, how public space can provide advantage for private endeavors. While instead, from Greg, I saw the opposite, the idea to explain what public means, you know, and so pushing for appropriation, for action, for, you know, taking ownership. So is this something that you think could link these two presentations? Do you have any comment?
Potentially, I guess, yes. But I will also say, I mean, with, you know, again, thinking about technology and these associated emerging sharing practices and business models, I will say that actually it's, although there is this risk of public spaces kind of trying to meet the private needs, but in the meantime, the public spaces actually can intrude or are intruding into those private spaces too, in a way, and blurring, again, those strict boundaries that for so long we looked at as designated spaces for each, you know, activity. But now it's becoming like more, you know, permeable and kind of blurring, which again, there are risks associated with it, but in the meantime, I think it might be helpful in terms of like this at the core of it, what public spaces are, that it's for everyone. So I'm kind of hopeful in a way that this blurriness actually will more like shift and make it more people-centric, environments for us, particularly when I think about from the point of the changing nature of the streets that so long has been very car-oriented. I mean, yes, cars operate with people, or at least so far. But in the meantime, we have created these environments that really pulled out that human factor from it. So anyhow, I mean, that's I feel like from my end, I mean, there's this blurriness happening, and hopefully in the direction of emphasizing more on the publicness.
And probably I would add to what's just been said, particularly the blurriness. And I think it's interesting, like what we're seeing since emergence of all these digital economies that come into being introduced into the physical spaces. You can, and I've done a lot of my research is post-Marxist theory. So then you see often you work with dialectics and see where contradiction and tensions come out through space, and where this constant renegotiation, conflicted spaces emerge, etc. But what I'm really finding very intriguing, in particular also in the work what I've been doing in Sierra Leone compared to what happened in Australia or here in Europe, is one way to contextualize it is there are two forms. For example, one is actually in having a GUI approach, and arguably the other one is a prickly approach. So the prickly approach is always very targeted, formalized, and spiky. It goes in and dictates a certain spatial practice and marginalizes and pokes other people's out. Why we're actually having more the GUI effect, where you work with hyper complexity, openness, and creativity, and you work around it in order to meet human needs. That's essentially what we're trying to accommodate here, is meeting human needs and also trying to pursue and develop towards something. What that is and what that ought to be, we can have that discourse, but if you, for example, in my line of work, when you work with urban health, you're trying to obtain a human condition which is beneficial to everybody, and public space is offering something for everyone, and there is something in for everybody how we can appropriate it. I just published recently a book on play in public space, and what I found also is there is this idea which emerged out of what I call singularity. No, it's singulation, because William White, for example, talked about triangulation when you reach out to other people's, right, and you create something. But singulation is an interesting public space appropriation in a way where you, ultimately with your phone, you're engaged in a private practice and you're being embedded in a public space, but you do not necessarily contribute in the same way to the quality of such, because you're completely disconnected in your cognitive notion being in the space. So what that might mean to that, if we doing it all collectively, are we fragmenting society and moving further away from what we call the urban commons, or have we completely privatized our existence in urban conflicted spaces? Is up for debate, or is it just a different form of space practice, and we as academics, we just document it and observe it and see what happens? But given the work what I'm doing in Africa at the moment, I'm shifting, and Luisa already rightfully pointed out, it's a call for action, because that's where land tenure is so heavily contested, and young people don't even have the cognitive means to fight for common urban place, which has gone so far that we even had to redefine what public space actually is. So a different starting point in that sense, and it seems to be in Australia, where we have a lot of public spaces which are completely privatized, and you have in rule bound, and therefore transgressive forms of public space appropriation cannot simply happen, otherwise you end up in jail, gives us a very different starting point. And it seems to be in working with young people in Australia, it's almost that privatization creeped in and everybody embraces it and makes do with it. Yeah. While in Sierra Leone, it has been eroded so far that cognitive doesn't even exist, and now they're fighting back for it. So the idea of right to the city is for me also very gooey and can happen in very different forms. Yeah.
Thank you. I know it's a complex question, especially when we talk about private spaces and how we can define a balance between private interests and the publicness. This is a big issue. Thank you for your answers.
Yeah. Can I just add something to that, or can I ask, actually, following Luisa's question? Taking the African Sierra Leone example, what I feel is in communities where formal planning and policies are not on the table, or maybe they are lacking, or they are not part of the tradition of managing or developing the cities, it seems to me that the placemaking, or do it yourself, or tactical interventions by using the power of public space can be a good tool, can be a good approach. And designing or planning the cities piece by piece, so it's a kind of piecemeal approach, maybe just like Christopher Alexander's approach, that we approach the cities in such a way that we don't actually privatize the public space, but yes, we take the ownership for, again, ourselves, for the public. So this seems to me a very strong tool which can work in spaces also like Cyprus, where at least in the north part, where planning is not going very well. So maybe we should really use these kind of approaches as a new method, or as a new approach to make our cities more sustainable and resilient and safe and equitable, or all positive aspects. This is how I feel. I don't know what you would say.
Yeah, that's a great comment, actually. And what I also learned to appreciate through the process is that placemaking in the privileged world, it's about how you can mobilize a lot of stuff, materiality, which we did not use and assemble it. Let's say 7-day makeovers, what David Enrich does and things, to transform public space, right? To get the ownership back. But interesting in the West African context, you don't have, there's a different issue with materiality. You cannot actually put your leftover stuff, what you have, which we're not using, into appropriate and make something very quickly and light, because simply you don't have the resourcing for anything, So the starting point, the benchmarking point is very different. But it's more what I learned is when we workshopped ideas of how to tactical urbanism, in that sense, how we can transform and make a meaningful contribution. That's where the flexibility kicks in, because you never underestimate the creativity that comes out of sheer necessity for survival. So what I'm talking about here is, for example, in this context, there is a lot of gender-based violence around wash points. Yeah, washing points are these points where you have a water pump for a whole neighborhood, and some of our community centers have been pushed to potentially where there's space for one, and so in order to then they said, let's do placemaking around the water point. So why can't we use some of the funding for the seed funding to create actually a hole down into the ground and get to groundwater, and then progressively build up a water point through placemaking. Absolutely fascinating approach to infrastructure provision, but because there is this public space center, they have safety and surveillance already. So now you can see how you change the narrative by modifying materiality in a very different sense when you come out of pluralist approaches and compared to, let's say, what we've done in Australia there. Yeah.
Thank you, Greg, for your comment. Any other? I think we have another question in the chat box.
Yes.
Anna is, since you mentioned blurring the line of what spaces are meant to you, do you also look into public space with the lens of affordance? The difficult one.
Well, I mean, I will say absolutely. I mean, when you start talking about people-centric, spaces intentionally, I mean, you can't avoid, this again, what those spaces will be for and what they will support and promote in terms of activities, interactions, and so on, and making sure that it becomes a place actually for everyone, for all the abilities too. Again, it depends on the scales also. I mean, the scales of the considerations. I mean, our current work, although it takes that under consideration, but in the meantime, the scale of the work we are doing right now, is not addressing it directly, but that's something, absolutely that we should look at it under that lens of affordances.
Can I add to affordances something? Particularly when
Yes.
based on the line of work, what I've done on clay, then already the definition from Heft and then from Gibson first and Harry Heft, and there is also the latest contribution. I think it was from what's this guy called? Chimero, and he's interrogated affordances because there's so many different ones, what it might mean and to where the boundary condition there is at the moment, which is quite interesting because what triggers in me is more the question of relationality. If you work with dynamics and across space and time, so if you create relationality and energy into a certain direction, you will see what kind of affordances essentially then you need to accommodate a certain transformation of space, which is quite intriguing in that sense. And public space as a concept itself is really brings this complexity together. And I think that's again another binding link between both of our contributions, because you can have it deteriorized with, let's say, the digital forms and then technologies associated to for mobility, for example. So human and non-human dimensions, or you really focus on simple, on the most simplest way, just on the human connection. But then even then there is a materiality to it, and certain materials afford something. And that image, what I showed with the two children playing, was interesting because how they're related, a lot of affordances they are deployed in the space to enable that. Particularly, I found the creative capacity of the child on this sponge mattress to fold it in the space and really appropriate the space over a longer period of time with such a minimum requirement of materiality. Which you often don't see anymore in our societies because there's other conditions around it, and I don't want to disqualify that. It's just a different way of appropriating space and based on different affordances, and also such simple concept of the ball, which is such a great symbol for play, how that one boy actually plays with it. However, he doesn't really throw it around to others because there's simply not enough space allocated. So the space is so conflicted because what you did not see is actually the three pigs in the sewage right next to him having a fight. So and that is another ball game again. But the concept of affordance, it can be very useful.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Greg. I think we need to wrap up. I know Celen has got some other appointments or duties. So I would like to thank both of our speakers who have contributed to our celebration of public space on the occasion of World Cities Day. Thank you for sharing your work and your thoughts with us. And thank you for our participants who were with us, listening and asking questions. Luisa?
Yes, I would like to thank you both as well. And thanks also to those who attended. I hope this session has been interesting and informative in regard of how to act local to go global, since our mission is always around the Agenda 2030 and the New Urban Agenda, as the Sebnem also recalled in the first presentation. So we will meet again for the last webinar that will take place at the end of November. All our webinars are recorded, and so this one also have been recorded and will be made available soon. Just follow, our social media, the Eastern Mediterranean University and Public Space Architecture, so that we can provide those contents to all of you and to those who would like to rewatch the meeting. Okay, so thank you again for participating and see you next month.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you.
That was great.
you.
All the best.
All the
Bye.
best. Stay safe.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.